The pine tree at the center of the square stood stripped and shivering, bark peeled in places by time and weather. And to it, chained like some outlaw, or worse, stood the bride. Her veil had frozen stiff across her shoulders, catching ice in its netted threads. Her dress, too fine for weather like this, clung wet to her legs, now the color of old porcelain. Her hands were red, wrists blistered where the iron cuff bit flesh. The chain, no longer than a yard of rusted links, was fastened tight to the trunk, just above the notch where the preacher's wife had said she'd make a spectacle of sin for the good of the children. Her name was Nora, though no one said it now. They called her the girl, that woman, the shame. Her eyes stayed open, unblinking against the sting of snow, lashes rimmed in frost. She wasn't crying. Not anymore. She had done all that in the dark, before the town stirred, before the baker opened his shutters and children peered out with wide, questioning eyes. Someone had thrown a crust of bread by her feet. It had frozen solid. The sheriff had passed by earlier, muttering under his breath, claiming his hands were tied. He wouldn't look her in the eye. None of them did. Not even the man who had once asked for her hand, who now sat in the saloon drinking off the guilt like it was something that could be rinsed from the soul. Nora had been married, briefly. 2 weeks ago, she'd stood in the chapel beside James Fletcher, tall and proud and frowning like marrying her was some act of mercy. The preacher had started the words. Then James had interrupted, turned, and in front of everyone, spat the word liar. "She's carrying another man's child," he said. And the silence that followed had been colder than this snow. She hadn't denied it. Not because it was true, but because her voice had caught in her throat. James had stepped away, shaken the dust from his boots like her dignity was something that clung, and walked out. The preacher stopped the ceremony. The town turned its back. Her own aunt refused her a room. The child inside her stirred, quiet still, like it was trying not to be seen. And in 2 days' time, Nora found herself chained to a tree for correction. A child cried across the square. His mother pulled him back, shushing him. Some folks passed by and shook their heads. Others whispered that she had brought it on herself, that decent women didn't end up pregnant before the wedding, no matter what she said. But Nora stood, feet numb, shoulders sagging but spine straight. The snow had painted her in pale grays, like a ghost. Yet her heart thudded with every breath. She was not broken. Not yet. It was just past morning when the boots came. Slow, deliberate. Not hurried like the postman. Not arrogant like the sheriff. These footsteps crunched with weight, with patience. Nora didn't lift her head. Not at first. She was used to passers-by now. But something about the way the wind shifted, the sudden hush, the pause in the air, made her look. He stood just beyond the tree line. Tall, maybe 35, but worn in the way men get when life has been a war. His coat was dusted in snow, wide-brimmed hat slanted low. A scar ran beneath his eye like a faded thread. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, really looked. Not with pity. Not with disgust. Like he was trying to place a name he once heard in a song. "You cold?" he asked, voice deep and calm. She didn't answer. Couldn't. Her throat was cracked and dry, words long since frozen. He stepped closer. The town watched from windows. Curtains twitched. But he didn't seem to care. He shrugged off his coat, a thick buffalo hide thing, and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched, more from confusion than fear. The weight of it, the sudden warmth, made her eyes water. "No one's given you a coat?" he asked. Still no reply. She wasn't sure if this was real or if her mind was dreaming mercy. But then he knelt, slowly, knees sinking into snow. He reached up and cupped her frozen hand in his. His fingers were calloused. Gentle. "Name's Elijah," he said. "You don't need to tell me yours unless you want to." She stared at him, unsure. He didn't press her. Just sat there beside her, like the two of them were resting on a Sunday walk, not anchored to the heart of humiliation. After a long silence, she rasped, "Nora." He nodded once. Didn't smile. Just breathed the name like it mattered. "You hungry?" Again, she hesitated. But he'd already turned. From his satchel, he pulled out a tin cup and a small wrapped bundle. Steam rose when he uncorked a flask and poured warm broth into the cup. He held it out. She tried to grasp it, but her hands trembled. Without a word, he steadied it for her, let her sip. It tasted like something real. Chicken. Time. Hope. From across the square, the sheriff stepped out, adjusting his belt. "She ain't your concern, mister," he called. Elijah didn't look up. "She's someone's," he said, almost to himself. Then he stood, slow as always, and pulled a short blade from his boot. Nora tensed. But he didn't raise it. He simply leaned in, examined the iron shackle, and began working at the rusted lock. It took time. The thing had fused with cold and shame. But eventually, with a soft click, it gave. She stumbled. He caught her, arms strong but tender. Not like a man taking, but like someone steadying a wild bird. People were gathering now. A crowd forming. Not shouting, but watching. Like they didn't know what to do with this quiet rebellion. Elijah faced them. "This woman," he said, voice carrying without rising, "is my wife." Gasps flickered through the bystanders. "I said what I said," he continued, "and I'll be taking her home." The preacher's wife stormed forward. "She's a harlot. She's disgraced." Elijah turned to Nora, then back to the crowd. She was disgraced by a coward who left her in the snow. James Fletcher pushed his way forward then, mouth twisted. "You can't just take her." "I ain't taking," Elijah said, hand lightly resting on the small of Nora's back. "She's coming if she wants to." For the first time in days, Nora felt something unfurl inside her chest. Not safety. Not yet. But the suggestion of it. Like the sun behind thick clouds. She looked up at Elijah, searching his face. There was no fire there. No demand. Just a space being made for her to stand. "I want to," she said, voice shaking but certain. He helped her step forward. The chain clinked once, then was gone. The snow fell lighter now. The wind still cruel, but bearable. As they walked away, Nora leaned into his side, not because she was weak, but because it felt right to do so. Behind them, the town stood silent. No one called out. No one stopped them. And though no one realized it then, the first crack had formed in the town's hard, frozen shell. A small, steady warmth had begun to spread. Nora did not look back. The cabin sat at the edge of the woods like a secret whispered by the trees. It wasn't much, a single room with a sloped roof, stone chimney leaning slightly from years of storms, and a door that creaked like it remembered every sorrow ever to cross its threshold. Smoke curled from the chimney into the pale afternoon sky, trailing upward like a promise not yet made. Inside, it was warmer than Nora had expected. Not just from the stove, which crackled with cedar logs, but from the way the space felt lived in without being hardened. Elijah led her in without speaking, only pausing to unhook the latch and kick snow from his boots. He offered no grand gesture, no sweeping declaration of safety. He simply helped her over the threshold, kept a steadying hand on her back as she stepped over the worn rug, and guided her to sit on a pine-wood chair softened with sheepskin. Nora didn't speak either. The coat he'd given her was heavy across her shoulders, damp at the hem, fragrant with something that reminded her of tobacco and juniper. She didn't ask what this place was to him. The fire said it all. He'd built this. Not just the cabin, but the silence inside it. It was the silence of a man who had been alone for a long time, and who had made peace with it. He handed her a blanket, thick and coarse, and turned back to the stove. His movements were simple, efficient. A pan scraped gently against metal. Water poured from a jug. The smell of beans and onion rose soon after, followed by a faint hiss of steam. She watched him from the chair, unsure what to say. He moved like someone who once knew violence, but had chosen stillness. Not out of weakness, but choice. When he finally spoke, it was not to ask questions or press her. "You'll be sore," he said, placing a wooden bowl into her hands. "From the cold, from standing too long." His voice was deeper indoors, less cut by wind, like something buried in the earth. "Eat what you can. I ain't much of a cook, but it'll do." She murmured thanks, voice hoarse. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held the bowl. The heat seeped into her palms, and she cradled it close. Each spoonful was plain but grounding. No spices, just the simplicity of sustenance. Still, it brought tears to her eyes, not from taste, but from the shocking kindness of it. No one had fed her in days. When she finished, she placed the bowl beside her. Elijah took it without ceremony and washed it in the metal basin by the window. The sun had slipped low, setting the edge of the sky on fire. Orange light spilled across the snow outside, glowing faint through the frosted glass. "You want to sleep?" he said, not asking. She nodded. He pointed to the bed, a single cot tucked near the back wall. The quilt atop it was faded, hand-stitched. "Take it. I'll be by the door if you need anything." She looked from the bed to him. "Where will you sleep?" He shrugged, lifting a wool blanket from a trunk. "I've slept in worse places." She hesitated. "You don't have to give me everything." His eyes met hers. "You've had everything taken." That was the first time she truly saw him. Not just the stranger with the coat, but the man behind the quiet. He wasn't trying to rescue her. He wasn't saving her to feel righteous. He was just someone who couldn't watch a woman freeze in the middle of town and walk by. That kind of man didn't need to be explained. He just was. The bed was softer than she expected. As she lay beneath the quilt, the warmth soaked into her bones. The room quieted. She could hear Elijah moving, setting a kettle on the stove, oiling something she couldn't see. Then his steps slowed. The chair near the door creaked under his weight. She closed her eyes. The snow kept falling outside. And inside, for the first time in days, she slept. Morning came in pale blue light. The air smelled of coffee and bread. Nora stirred beneath the quilt, unsure where she was at first. Then she saw the pine walls, the low-beamed ceiling, the corner stove, and remembered. Elijah was already up. He sat near the window, cup in hand, watching the snow fall as if it were some scripture only he could read. He turned when she moved, gave a short nod. "There's coffee, if you want." She sat up slowly, muscles aching but no longer frozen. "I'd like some." He poured it into a tin cup and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed. She noticed how steady his hands were, how he moved with no wasted motion. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. He shook his head. "Didn't need to." She sipped. The coffee was strong, unrefined, but real, like everything else about him. They sat in silence a while. It wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that follows disaster, where words haven't returned yet, and the soul is still sweeping ash from its corners. Eventually, he spoke. "Folks'll be talking today." She stared at her cup. "Let them." He nodded. "Still, if you want to stay a while, I don't mind." Nora looked at him then, truly looked. "Why did you say I was your wife?" He didn't answer immediately. He set his cup down, leaned back in the chair. His eyes, pale gray-green, softened. "Because they wouldn't have let you leave with dignity otherwise. And I figured if they needed a name to swallow their pride, I'd give them one." She swallowed. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." "You don't know what they said about me." "I heard what mattered." "And if it were true?" she asked, voice trembling slightly. "If I really was carrying another man's child?" He met her gaze. "Then you were still left in the cold." That part didn't change. Her eyes burned. She looked away. Elijah leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I used to ride with men who didn't flinch at watching others suffer. I've seen towns burn, seen women hung for less than what you endured. I walked away from that life. Not because I got soft, but because I got tired of watching the world turn cruel." He paused. "What they did to you wasn't just cruel. It was cowardly." Nora's hands trembled. She clutched the coffee tighter to stop them. He sat back again. "So if my name buys you peace, take it. No strings. You don't owe me anything." The simplicity of it struck her harder than any narration. No expectations. No demands. Just decency, offered like bread. She stood, walked slowly to the window and stared out. Snow dusted the edge of the porch. 2 birds flitted in the bare branches. Somewhere in town, someone would be lighting a stove, muttering about her, cursing Elijah's name too. But out here, there was only stillness. And the man who had chosen not to look away. "Thank you," she said softly. He didn't answer. But his presence said enough. Days passed like melted snow, slow and quiet. Nora stayed. Not because she was afraid to leave, but because her soul needed stillness. Elijah didn't push her. He went about his work, splitting wood, mending the roof, hunting for rabbits. In the evenings, he sat with her by the fire, sometimes whittling, sometimes reading from an old leather book of poems. She found herself talking more. First about small things, where she'd grown up, what kind of tea she liked, a memory of her mother singing during spring planting. Then deeper truths surfaced. How James had courted her. How she'd felt safe with him, until the day she told him the truth. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said one night. "I trusted someone. A friend of my brother's. He was kind, until he wasn't." Elijah didn't move. "I told James before the wedding. I thought he'd understand. He said he forgave me. Then, at the altar." Her voice broke. Elijah didn't touch her, didn't intrude. But she felt the air shift around him, like a great sorrow had opened beneath the surface. "They said I seduced the man. That I was wild, loose. The women turned first. Then the men. My aunt said she couldn't house shame under her roof. She stared into the fire. And then I was just nothing. No one." Elijah stirred. Not much. Just enough to say he was listening. "You're not no one," he said at last. She looked at him, eyes wet. "Then who am I?" He met her gaze. "Someone who survived. Someone who deserves better." The words weren't magic. They didn't erase pain. But they rooted something in her, a seed of belief that hadn't existed before. That night, she stood at the threshold of the cabin while he set out another blanket on the chair. The wind had calmed. Snowflakes drifted like whispers across the sky. She turned. "Why don't you take the bed tonight?" He shook his head. "I'm fine. I want you to." He hesitated. "You sure?" She nodded. "You've done enough." He gave a faint smile, small but real. "All right then." She turned away, heart thudding. Not from fear. From something older, quieter. Trust. The next morning, the world felt different. Brighter. Not in light, but in clarity. Nora stepped onto the porch and stared across the snow blanket toward town. She knew the world hadn't changed. There were still cruel people in Clearwater. Still whispers. Still shame. But she wasn't alone anymore. And that made everything different. Elijah stepped beside her. They stood in silence for a moment, sharing breath in the cold. "I'll go into town later," he said. Nora looked at him. "Why?" "Need supplies. And people need to see your name ain't one they get to bury." She hesitated. "What if they come for me again?" He turned to her, eyes steady. "Then they'll meet a man who don't walk away." She felt her chest rise with something that felt like courage. Or hope. Maybe both. "I'll go with you," she said. He studied her face. "You sure?" She nodded. "If I don't stand beside the man who stood for me, what kind of woman would I be?" He smiled then, truly smiled. And for a moment, the snow seemed to pause around them. Together, they stepped down from the porch, boots crunching into the whiteness. The wind tugged gently at her shawl, but she didn't feel cold. She felt seen. And though the town waited beyond the trees, filled with all its petty cruelties and rusted judgments, She walked toward it with a man who had looked at her, not like a fallen woman, but like someone worth rising for. The days unfolded slowly in the hollow of that snow-fringed world, one breath-soft morning at a time. The wind still hissed through the pines, and the town still whispered behind cupped hands, but Nora no longer lived beneath their shadow. The cabin became her rhythm, its walls absorbing her silence, its hearth stitching warmth into her once frozen limbs. The hurt she carried did not vanish. It softened, became a weight that could be set down piece by piece without fear of it being stolen. Each morning, she woke to the sound of Elijah chopping wood. Not violently. His axe fell with precision, each strike like a heartbeat that steadied the world around her. She'd lie under the quilt a few minutes longer, listening, letting the rhythm settle into her chest before rising to tend to the small tasks he'd left undone, warming the kettle, folding the blanket he used in the chair, sweeping the pine needles that found their way in through the threshold. She wasn't beholden to these acts. No one expected them. But there was a comfort in their quiet return. He rarely spoke unless needed, but his presence filled the room like the scent of cedar. When he did speak, it was never loud. His voice moved like creek water, low and patient. He would ask how she slept, offer her coffee or the last slice of pan-fried cornbread, and sometimes leave a book on the table without explanation, a well-worn volume of Whitman or a faded copy of Psalms, pages feathered with use. Nora, once a schoolteacher before all the shame had taken her name from the ledger, found herself reading again. Her fingers, raw and stiff just a week ago, now turned pages slowly, tracing lines of poetry like threads of her own buried voice. Sometimes she read aloud, soft enough that her voice barely reached past the fire. Elijah didn't always respond, but he'd pause in his whittling or glance her way from the table, and she'd know he was listening. Healing came in odd shapes. Not in grand narrations or sweeping recoveries, but in things like combing her hair without wincing, in sleeping through the night, in laughing, quietly, unexpectedly, when Elijah made a dry remark about the owl who kept tapping on the roof beam like it owned the place. They didn't speak about the past much. Not hers. Not his. But traces came through, as if they trusted the silences to do most of the speaking. One evening, as the snow thickened into a curtain across the windows, Nora sat mending a tear in her sleeve while Elijah stirred a pot of venison stew. The fire flickered against his profile, outlining the shadow of an old wound across his jaw. She watched him a moment before asking, "What made you stop?" He didn't look up. "Stop what?" "Being what you were before." He stirred slower, then set the ladle aside. "There was a boy. 14, maybe. Too young to have a pistol. Too quick with his mouth. Thought calling me out would make him a man." Her needle paused. "I shot him before I knew what I was doing," Elijah said, voice low. "Not because I wanted to. Because it was habit." Silence fell again. This one heavier. "And after?" she asked gently. "I put my gun in the river and walked till I found a place where no one asked me what I'd done." He turned to face her. Clearwater was quiet. "I thought I could keep my name low, trade labor for peace. Turns out, peace don't come unless you're willing to defend it for someone else." Nora's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "Don't be. That boy. He reminds me to keep my hands open." They ate in silence after that, not because the words were done, but because enough had been said for one night. Later, as the coals dimmed and the wind picked up, she hesitated by the cot. Elijah was already settling into the chair, his blanket folded across his lap. "You know," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "you could sleep in the bed." He glanced up, brow furrowed. "I mean," she added quickly, "just for a night. It's warmer, and we both know that chair's older than either of us." He smiled faintly but didn't move. "I appreciate it. But you need it more." "I don't think I do, not anymore." He studied her. "It's not about who needs it." "Then what is it about?" He hesitated. "It's about not crossing lines you haven't drawn." Nora stood still. The fire cracked behind her. She nodded. "Thank you." That night, she slept soundly, knowing the man who sat near the door wasn't guarding her like a possession, but like a prayer he dared not say aloud. As winter thickened, they ventured further. Once a week, Elijah would saddle his horse and ride into town, bringing back flour, salt, the occasional letter he never opened. Nora went with him only once. Faces turned as she walked Clearwater's main road, shoulders straight, chin lifted. Some women looked away. A few stared too long. But she didn't flinch. She stood beside Elijah at the mercantile, fingers wrapped around the small list she'd written in careful script. When Mrs. Hanley tried to ignore her, Elijah said simply, "She's buying sugar." "That's not a crime last I checked." The sugar was handed over. That night, they shared biscuits sweetened slightly at the edges. Nora laughed for the first time in weeks, and Elijah nearly smiled wide enough to show his teeth. Not everything was easy. Some days Nora woke with the memory of chains heavy on her chest. She would sit on the porch with her knees pulled up, staring into the trees, fists clenched. Elijah never interrupted. He'd bring her tea. Sit near. Say nothing. Let her fight the ghosts at her own pace. She grew to love him for that. And slowly, the space between them changed. He began brushing the snow from her shoulders without asking. She began folding his shirts, lining them along the narrow shelf. They sat closer at the table. Her fingers lingered a second longer when passing him tools. His eyes followed her a little longer when she spoke. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was the kindling of something that could hold warmth. One morning, while hanging clothes on the line behind the cabin, Nora felt a kick inside her. Sharp, insistent. She gasped, hand flying to her belly. Elijah was chopping wood nearby. He turned at the sound. She smiled at him. It kicked. He set the axe down, wiping his hands on his trousers. "May I?" She nodded, and he stepped forward, tentative, almost reverent. His hand was warm against the curve of her belly. He waited. The child kicked again, and his expression shifted. Not surprise, not joy, but something more solemn. "She's strong," he said softly. Nora blinked. "You think it's a girl?" He looked at her, eyes steady. "Seems right." For a moment, they just stood there, breath misting in the cold, hands touching over the life between them. "I've been thinking about names," Nora said. He didn't respond, but she could tell he was listening. "I like Hope." He nodded. "Hope's good." She watched him, heart stammering. "Do you want to be part of this? I mean, truly." Elijah's jaw tightened slightly. "I don't want to make you feel beholden." "You don't." He looked at her, snow falling soft into his beard. "Then yes. If you'll have me." Nora stepped closer. "I already do." No kiss followed. No grand gesture. Just a shared breath in the cold, a hush that made the world tilt slightly toward spring. That night, she lay in bed while Elijah moved around the cabin, banking the fire, checking the lock on the door. She watched him as one might watch the sky before a storm. Curious, respectful, aware of the power beneath the surface. "Elijah," she said. He turned. "I'm not afraid anymore." He didn't smile, but his eyes shone. "Then we're doing something right." She reached a hand toward him. He came slowly, as if unsure the invitation was real. When he took her hand, she squeezed it, then let go. They didn't sleep in the same bed that night, but the distance between cot and chair felt smaller than ever. Morning brought a thin light and the quiet drip of thaw from the eaves. The snow wasn't gone, not yet, but it had softened. The first signs of melt whispered beneath the crust, promising a change that came not in storms, but in steady warmth. Nora sat by the window, the quilt around her shoulders. Elijah brewed coffee. Neither of them spoke. But something had shifted, and neither of them would be the same. By the time spring whispered through the trees, melting the snow in patches along the hillside, Nora had grown used to the hush that surrounded Elijah's land. It was a silence full of presence, not absence. The wind no longer howled like it used to. It sighed now, softer, weaving through budding branches and rippling the thawing creek just beyond the clearing. The world was waking, and so was she. Every day, her steps grew steadier. She moved with more ease, belly round beneath her apron, hands steady as she tended the hearth or folded clean linens. Her voice no longer caught in her throat when she spoke of the baby, and her laughter no longer felt foreign. There were still moments, quiet shadows that crept in at dusk, memories that clung like smoke, but they came less often, and when they did, she had learned to breathe through them. Elijah's presence made it easier. He didn't try to fix what hurt. He just stayed, a mountain in her storm. The townsfolk had started talking again, not with the same cruel venom they once wielded, but with a grudging or reserve for things they couldn't explain. Nora, the girl they had left to freeze, was still alive. Still standing. And she walked beside Elijah now, chin lifted, hands cradling new life like a badge no one could tarnish. The man who had once disappeared from their memory had become her shield, her shadow, and, though unspoken, her home. So when James Fletcher returned, dust-covered and smug, riding into town like he'd never been gone, the quiet they'd built cracked like ice in spring. It began with whispers. A rider spotted on the southern road. A coat too fine for a drifter. A pistol at his side, clean and polished. Some said he'd come back for revenge, others claimed it was guilt. But Nora felt the shift before anyone spoke it aloud. That evening, Elijah stood longer at the edge of the woods, watching the road without pretending to. His jaw was tight, and though he didn't say it, Nora knew. The next morning, they walked into town together. Nora wore her blue shawl, the one Elijah had mended with thread the same color as her eyes. The baby shifted beneath her ribs, restless with the rhythm of her steps. Elijah's hand stayed near her back, guiding without pushing. They had meant only to visit the general store, but the moment they crossed the threshold of the street, the atmosphere turned thick. James stood outside the saloon. He looked older, somehow. Not in the face, but in the hollowness behind his eyes. Like the guilt had eaten more than time ever could. His boots were dusty, his hat cocked with the same arrogance he'd worn the day he left Nora at the altar. But his eyes, when they landed on her, flinched. "Elijah," he said, voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Didn't expect to see you still in town." Elijah didn't stop walking, but his steps slowed. Nora placed a hand on his arm. James turned his gaze to her. "Nora." She met it without faltering. "I heard you been calling her your wife," James said. "Funny, seeing as I left her unclaimed." The words hung heavy. A few townsfolk paused in their errands, lingering by doors and wagons. Nora didn't blink. "You didn't leave me unclaimed, James. You left me unkind." Murmurs stirred. A boy dropped a sack of grain and didn't bother to pick it up. James stepped forward. "You carrying my child, and yet you wear another man's name." "It was never your child," she said, voice level. "You knew that. You just didn't care." James scoffed. "Even if it wasn't mine, it was your shame." Elijah took one step forward. Not fast. Not threatening. Just enough to bring quiet. "It was your cowardice that shamed her," he said. "Not the child. Not the truth." James's jaw twitched. "You planning to play father, then? Raise another man's mistake?" Nora stepped between them. Her voice did not rise, but it rang with something that held the crowd still. "She is not a mistake," she said. "She's the reason I kept breathing when the world chained me to a tree." Someone gasped. It might have been the preacher's daughter. Nora's hand found Elijah's. "She'll be born into a home where truth matters more than pride. Where kindness isn't weakness." James looked like he wanted to speak, but the words curdled behind his teeth. The pistol on his hip glinted. He glanced at Elijah, then at the people gathered. No one moved. "I could claim her now," he said suddenly, desperate. "Marry you. Make it right." "You don't get to rewrite what you ruined," Elijah said, tone calm. "She gave you her trust. You spit on it." James's hand moved toward his gun. Elijah didn't reach for his. Nora stepped closer to James. "If you raise that pistol, you're not proving you're a man. You're proving you're still the boy who left a woman to die in the snow." Her words landed like a slap. For a breath, James's fingers hovered over the grip. Then he stepped back, exhaling like the air had betrayed him. The sheriff pushed through the crowd then, finally deciding to play his part. "Mr. Fletcher," he said, voice edged with warning. "Might be time you rode on." James stared at Nora for a long moment, as if trying to find the girl he once knew in the woman who stood before him. But she was no longer there. The girl he'd scorned had burned in the frost. What remained was ash turned to iron. He turned and mounted his horse. No one stopped him. No one waved. As he rode out of town, Nora felt Elijah's hand find hers again. Not as a shield this time. As a vow. They turned toward the churchyard, not because they owed anyone faith, but because Nora needed to breathe in the space that once tried to bury her. The pine tree still stood at the center of the square. It had changed little, bark scarred, trunk lean, but it no longer loomed. It waited. Nora stepped toward it, her feet slow but certain. "Elijah," she said quietly, "this is where it ended." He stood beside her. "Then let's make it where something begins." She reached into the pocket of her shawl and pulled out a small ribbon. The same one that had once tied her hair on the day she was to be married. She tied it to a low branch. The breeze caught it, lifted it gently. "I thought this place would haunt me forever," she whispered. "Now it bears your name," Elijah replied. She turned to him. "Not yet." His brow furrowed. Nora smiled. "You called me your wife. I want it to be true." He stilled. The crowd had dispersed. Only the wind remained. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm sure." There were no bells, no gowns, no preacher. Just two people standing where cruelty had once stood taller. Elijah reached into his coat and pulled out a ring. Simple, silver, worn. "This was my mother's," he said. She never had much, but she said love's worth didn't shine. It stayed. He slipped it onto her finger. Her hands were trembling now, not from fear, but from the enormity of peace. "Nora," he said, "you are my home." She breathed in sharply. "And you are my shelter." They kissed, not with heat, but with the reverence of survivors who'd found something worth trusting. A few townsfolk watched from windows. No one interrupted. No one dared. Later, as they walked back to the cabin, the sky turned gold along the horizon. The sun dipped low, and the air smelled of thawing earth. They crossed the threshold together. Inside, the fire still burned. And for the first time, Nora laid her hand against her belly and said, without fear, "We're safe now." Elijah stood behind her, arms around her shoulders. She leaned into him. The past had not been erased. The names thrown at her would never fully fade. But new ones had taken root. Wife, mother, hope. They stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching the sky fall into stars. Tomorrow would come. And when it did, they'd be ready. Not because the world had softened, but because they had become stronger than its cruelty. Ashes still clung to memory. But from ashes, new names rose. The spring came slow that year, like it was afraid of disturbing what winter had left behind. It crept in under the eaves and into the bones of the cabin, melted the last of the ice from the edge of the roof, and coaxed life from places where all had once seemed still. Buds appeared on the trees like promises whispered by the earth. Birds returned, hesitant at first, then with the full conviction of creatures who'd survived more winters than they cared to count. Nora stood on the porch, her belly full and low now, wrapped in the pale shawl Elijah had mended again for her. She rested one hand on the worn post, the other on the small of her back, watching the meadow unfurl into green. The wind brushed her hair back from her face, not cruel anymore, but curious. It carried the scent of thawing soil, of pine, of something like freedom. Behind her, Elijah moved quietly in the kitchen, boiling water for tea, slicing the last of the dried apples. He whistled under his breath, low, tuneless, content. He'd always said little, but what he did say stayed. When she first came to his door, he had offered no questions, no demands, only his name. Now, months later, he had offered her everything. His home, his steadiness, his name. The cabin had changed. It held more color now. Nora had stitched curtains from an old dress, and he'd carved shelves for her books, placing them with a kind of reverence that made her throat tighten. The cradle he'd built sat near the hearth, smooth and strong. She'd found him one evening smoothing the last of the wood with his hands like he was trying to memorize it. When she asked if it was finished, he said quietly, "It's ready whenever she is." The baby hadn't come yet, but Nora felt her nearing. Each breath pulled more space into her ribs, more ache into her hips. But she was not afraid. She had walked through pain alone once. This time, she would walk through it with a hand she could hold. That morning, Elijah stepped out onto the porch beside her. He carried a mug and handed it to her without a word. She took it, grateful. The warmth seeped into her palms. He stood beside her in silence, both of them looking out at the field where grass was beginning to rise. "Looks like rain," he said finally. She nodded. "The good kind." "Yeah." She sipped, then asked, "Do you think we'll ever be free of it?" He didn't ask what she meant. He rarely did. "The past," he said. "Or the people who won't forget it?" "Both." He took a long breath. "The world doesn't forget. But sometimes it forgives, if you teach it how." She turned toward him, touched his arm. "You did." He looked at her, then really looked. "No, you did." Later that day, she returned to the tree. Not alone. Elijah walked beside her, one hand on the small of her back, steadying her as the dirt road dipped and climbed. The town was quiet when they entered, quieter than it had ever been. Maybe because folks had finally learned that silence was sometimes a form of respect. Or maybe because the story of a woman surviving what Nora had could only end two ways, and hers was the one they hadn't expected. The pine tree stood just as it had months ago, roots tangled in memory, trunk marred by old scars. But the chain was gone. The ground around it had thawed, and a small patch of wildflowers bloomed near the base. She didn't know who planted them. Perhaps no one. Perhaps the earth remembered, too, and offered what it could. Nora took Elijah's hand and stepped forward. This was where it had begun. Her public humiliation, her near undoing. But she felt no fear now. No tremble in her chest, no shame in her breath. She stood tall, round with child, ring on her finger, husband at her side. She untied the ribbon from the low branch. It had faded in the sun, pale now, its ends frayed. She held it between her fingers for a moment, then folded it into her palm. "It's time," she said. Elijah nodded once. They walked together to the edge of town, where the preacher stood waiting by the field. He had asked no questions when Nora sent word. Just nodded. Said he'd be there. Behind him stood half the town, faces Nora had grown used to avoiding. But now, they looked at her differently. Not with pity. Not with the fear that cruelty brings. But with something quieter. Curiosity. Respect. Some even with guilt. Nora and Elijah stood beneath the open sky. No chapel, no altar. Just wild grass beneath their feet and the sun trying to break through thick clouds above. There was no speech, no sermon. Just two hands meeting, two eyes locking. "I don't want words to make this," Nora said. "I want truth." Elijah nodded. "Then speak it." She looked at him. "You saw me when I was broken. You didn't try to fix me. You just held what was left until I could stand again." Elijah's voice was barely more than a breath. "You made me lay down every gun I ever carried, just by standing." She smiled. "Do you take me?" "I already have." The preacher stepped forward, his voice quiet. "You've made your vows in the sight of the Lord and those who remember. You are husband and wife." The crowd didn't cheer. But they didn't walk away, either. Some clapped softly. A few wept. And one little girl stepped forward with a daisy in her hand and gave it to Nora. She tucked it behind her ear, tears threatening. Elijah placed his hand gently on her belly. "Soon," he said. That night, the wind shifted. The sky broke open, and the rain came, not angry, but strong. It beat on the roof like a drum, filled the rain barrel to its brim, sang against the windows. Nora woke before dawn, breath caught, one hand on her stomach. "Elijah," she whispered, sitting up. He rose instantly, already beside her. "It's time." She nodded, face pale, hands shaking, but not from fear. He helped her to the chair, built the fire higher, fetched the clean cloths and the water they'd been boiling every day for weeks. Everything was ready. But it was her steadiness that surprised him most. The way she breathed through the pain, the way she leaned into it, not as punishment, but as passage. Hours passed. The storm outside raged, but inside, the cabin pulsed with another kind of storm, rhythmic, ancient, raw. Nora clenched the sides of the bed. Elijah wiped her brow, held her when the pain bent her forward, whispered soft things even she couldn't hear through the roar in her ears. When the child came, it was with a cry that filled the room and shook the silence from every rafter. A girl. Strong lunged. Red-faced. Perfect. Nora laughed and wept all at once. Elijah placed the child into her arms. She stared down at the tiny face, the fingers that opened and closed as if holding secrets from another world. "Hope," she whispered. Elijah sat beside her, arm around her shoulders, lips against her temple. "You carried her," he said, voice husky. "She carried me," Nora replied. The storm passed. Morning came. The cabin glowed with the scent of new life and firewood. Outside, the tree swayed gently in the wind. They buried the old ribbon beneath its roots and planted daffodils in its place. The town spoke of her with new words now. Some still whispered, but others spoke her name with reverence. They said she survived a storm the town created, that she rose from ashes without bitterness, that she gave her daughter the name she herself had once needed, and that when the wind blew just right through the fields outside Clearwater, you could hear a woman's laugh there, soft, free. The wind carried her name, and it always would.